and welcome back to the Camera Rolling Podcast. This is episode 15, and I'm your host, Ronnie. Today, we are talking about Lifetime. And yes, I know I keep changing my setup, but, I'm indecisive, so. So last year I did a video talking about the bad movies that Hallmark pumps out, but I feel like the other channel that also seems to just pump out the worst movies is Lifetime. Lifetime generally has a combination of a lot of different genres, but the ones I'm going to be talking about specifically today are the ones that are like drama thrillers. However, in the grand world of Lifetime, they have movies ranging from a rom-com to true crime or based on a book or based on a true story type of movies. And somehow, just like Hallmark, they managed to make all of their titles sound so similar, it's almost impossible to recognize one from the other. But one thing that the drama thrillers have in common is the idea of causing suburban white mom hysteria. Many of the titles specifically target an audience of women who are afraid of crazy things happening in their idyllic lives through movies like A Wife's Nightmare, or A Daughter's Nightmare, or A Sister's Nightmare. They even have titles like Sugar Babies, One Night Stand Murder, Psycho BFF, and Dating a Sociopath. I would say that this particular genre of movie is like the definition of it's so bad it's good. Mainly because, at the very least, they are entertaining. Whereas I feel like Hallmark movies they're not entertaining and they're just bad. And I wanted to mention really quick that there's actually another creator on here who does and talks about Lifetime movies, specifically like different like categories of them, like cheerleader movies and things like that within the Lifetime universe. So I'll leave her channel down below because they're just really good videos. Either way, similar to Hallmark, Lifetime tends to capitalize off of the same exact tropes in every way possible. Whether the antagonist is not who we thought it was the whole time, or the main character has to have some physical altercation at the end of the movie before the cops can get there somehow, or the main character just straight up is the antagonist and we just have to watch in horror. All of the movies follow very similar tropes. And I noticed upon looking at their history that many of the films on the channel are actually based on true stories, even if they're not specifically considered to be like based on a true crime story. And if you're an avid true crime listener like me, you know that there's like no shortage of crazy stories of people doing crazy things, especially ones related to like crimes of passion. However, even with their basis in reality, Lifetime still manages to push the drama to the point that it's just so unbelievable, or that it just doesn't make any sense. So the main thing I wanted to discuss in this episode is sort of this idea of hysteria, where it comes from, and why they would do this. So one of the reasons I wanted to make this episode is because I feel like Lifetime has a very specific audience, and I feel like their audience is very prone to hysteria. It's very clear that the movies aired on Lifetime are aimed most specifically at women. Besides featuring women as the main lead of the movies, the subject matter often relates heavily to what society might deem as more feminine or like woman-type issues. More specifically, the subjects may include things like interpersonal drama as it relates to their family, neighbors, children, or love life. Hardly ever do we actually have a female lead that has drama specifically related to her job or like outside interests. This is important to note because most of the time when we watch TV or even just media in general, we do it to escape our own lives, but we also have this desire to identify with what we are watching. That's part of why representation is really important to minority groups, because we want something that we are able to identify with. And it's often difficult to engage with something that we don't identify with personally. With that in mind, we also have to take into account how these movies are presented. If you've ever been homesick on a weekday, you may notice Lifetime is playing similar movies all day long. Other networks often cater their programming to certain audiences, like when cartoons play early morning weekends because children are awake at that time. Similarly, Lifetime knows its audience. Their audience is probably tuning in to their outrageous dramas because both they want something to relate to with the main character, but also they want something that is exciting and different than the life that they have, i.e., their content is aimed at the suburban housewife. NPR has an interesting article talking about the meaning of suburban women and what it means in terms of voting, but in this context, it's a generalization related to the idea of the 1950s housewife. This is usually defined as someone who is generally home all day taking care of the household, someone who doesn't earn the primary income, and lives in a neighborhood where their neighbors are of a similar demographic. And though the 50s housewife stereotype is quickly dying out because of the economic pressures that we're all dealing with now, it still stands that there is a demographic of women who enjoy this particular genre of TV movies while they are at home during the day. And making movies with the intention of reaching a specific demographic also brings about the question of what do they intend their viewers to think and feel having watched it. As a filmmaker, you always have to ask yourself what you want your audience to take away. What questions do you want them to ask walking away from it? And not necessarily questions about the movie itself, but more so in relation to their own lives. A lot of my favorite movies are my favorites because they gave me a new perspective on something, or they made me ask questions about a particular subject that they talk about in the movie. One of my favorite movies is Arrival because it talks about time and memory, and there's like a little bit of language that's thrown in there, and so I find those subjects to be particularly interesting, and it gave me a new perspective on those subjects. So the question stands, why do they make these movies, and what do they want people to walk away with? One movie from Lifetime that particularly stands out to me is the 2010 movie The Pregnancy Pact. The movie is based on a true story of a group of high school girls that decide to get pregnant around the same time. This movie is sort of similar to the way cyberbully is, like I talked about last week, in that it has been known to get a few laughs because of how ridiculous the movie makes the situation appear, but it also tries to discuss extremely important and serious topics at the same time. And like cyberbully, the Pregnancy Pact sort of posits itself as a PSA. But again, I have to ask myself, to whom is this angled at? If Lifetime's audience is supposed to be the stereotypical suburban, bored housewife, why would they want to make a movie about teen pregnancy? Well, in reality, the movie actually does focus a lot on the adults and the opinions that the adults have. So it makes sense that the movie might be angled at a group of women that are stereotypically people who are extremely involved in their children's lives and want to maintain sort of a control over them. To further explain, the movie centers around an online journalist who wants to write a story about the growing number of pregnancies in her hometown and the group of girls who all get pregnant around the same time. And in having so many different characters, the movie gives the audience ample opportunity to identify with one or more of them, as their opinions on teen pregnancy and contraception are made clear throughout the movie. I think more importantly, we're supposed to identify with one of the moms who's very involved with the school and like the school board, and sort of sits on this like sort of high pedestal, and sort of treats her daughter with like the same sort of like high expectations, but we're watching as her daughter is like getting pregnant on purpose, which seems to go against every bit of morality that her mother has supposedly like told her throughout the years. So part of the hysteria, I guess, surrounding this movie has to do with how the group of girls are portrayed. They often make comments about pregnancy being magical or cool because they'll get to create their own little family. The lax approach to pregnancy would make any mother fearful because it doesn't take into account the reality behind motherhood. Much of the time, this has to do with being under or misinformed about the process. There's a lot of pain and discomfort in the pregnancy itself, along with afterwards. Part of the journalist's mission when she is there is to emphasize the reality of the situation to the girls and the people around them. And in many ways, I would say that I identify the most with the journalist, who's essentially the main character. She kind of works as a narrator and to sort of like move the story along, but at the same time, there's sort of like the other main character, which is like one of the teen girls who's sort of watching as everything's happening, as well as also sort of like getting pregnant. However, one of the problems that I find with movies like this that like pose these sort of questions, or more so cover these sort of issues with sort of the drama and fictionality that they do, is that they still sort of pose this actionary response. More so the idea that action should be taken in some capacity. And I will say this movie does do a good job of posing a question and trying to answer it by the end, or trying to find a solution. I know a lot of times, like, people will just complain about something, but then they don't pose any sort of solution or resolution, so it really just seems like complaining. So at the very least, they do take some sort of stance at the end, but I'll talk more about that later. But one of the problems that I do have with the way that this movie goes about asking these questions and answering it is that it literally says at the beginning of the movie, who is to blame and what do we do about this? And I'm on the side that when it comes to things that are not inherently good or bad, that there is no one to blame specifically. Like, there's a lot of blame to spread around, but like, there's no point in asking that question if the answer is very clearly not one particular individual. The film spends a good portion of its time on what the adults think should be done and their opinions. And of course, our main character, our journalist, believes that contraception and education should be available, whereas many of the parents of the students believe that they need to push abstinence harder because contraceptions promote sexual behavior. And I'll link a few articles down below for reference, but it's literally been studied at the wazoo that when teens have access to sex education and contraceptives, that teen pregnancy actually goes down. But as someone who grew up in a small town, there's a lot of people who still think like this and still think that like contraception equals like sexual activity, whereas in reality, like, it can reduce a lot of the problems that come from having like unsafe sex. Needless to say, I think the focus on the adults is really important in this movie because a lot of adults tend to make things about themselves, even when sometimes it's literally not. So throughout the movie, like I said, there is a mom that we sort of are supposed to identify with a little bit more. She's more strict. She sort of, again, treats her daughter like putting her on this pedestal, but she has to have a reality check with herself and question whether or not she's going to be a hypocrite when her daughter becomes pregnant. And honestly, I've never understood people who genuinely are okay with being a hypocrite and not seeing like the nuance of a situation. But I will say that, like, I am glad that throughout the movie, the mom, the main character type mom, decides to be a little less of a hypocrite and, like, tries to be more understanding of both her daughter and everyone else who gets pregnant. Because she very much has, like, conflicting opinions throughout the entire movie. Like, at the beginning, it seems like she might be compassionate because they're talking about, like, the teen pregnancies rising and stuff, and she's like, oh, well, we have to be nice, we have to be compassionate towards them and, like, show them, like, grace, you know? But then other times she'll be like, they're stupid for getting pregnant. So it's, like, very conflicting that, like, she would put this on to be like, we need to be compassionate, when, like, she clearly doesn't have any compassion for these teen girls. Either way, the fact that she, like, sort of lets up on her opinion and gets a little less strict and realizes that, like, maybe keeping information from children is not the best thing to do when they have hormones and urges is, like, at least good on her. However, when we see things from the daughter's perspective, she's a little less so. Throughout the entire movie, she really doesn't realize the gravity of the situation of her essentially lying to her boyfriend in order to get pregnant just so she can be pregnant like her friends. And it only occurs to her that, like, pregnancy might not be, like, the best thing in the world when she overhears other people talking about how they've ruined their lives now and they'll never go to college, and her boyfriend even tells her that he doesn't want children. Like, the reactions of their friends, family, boyfriends, and community, like, very much is, like, very negative towards them, and it's just very interesting to me because it took them that long to, like, hear these things, and it took her that long to, like, hear these things and sort of question herself a little bit. However, things don't really come to a head for our main pregnant teen girl until she starts to realize that it's tearing her life and her family apart. Like, her mom is embarrassed and is potentially getting kicked off of her, like, presidency role on, like, the school board or, like, the family school board. It's something along those lines. And of course her dad seems to be facing some sort of scrutiny, but he's just really not a main player in this movie. Also, when her boyfriend and his family finds out, like, his parents are super against it and they don't want their son to do anything with her, whereas her parents are looking for child support from him because it's going to be his baby, and it causes this huge rift between the families. It also really sets in when she sees her friend give birth, and her friend has, like, the worst time.
Door what? Down there, stupid.
And I think even more so as she sees her friend change after giving birth. All of the girls had talked so much about, like, what great parents they were going to be, how attentive they were going to be, and we see one of the friends in particular, after she's given birth, pretty much throw all of that out the window. She ends up smoking near her child. She also falls into this sort of jaded type of mentality that her mom has. And of course she had spent most of the first part of the movie saying, like, I won't be like my mom who never pays attention to me, who's essentially neglected me and not been, like, very great to me, and ends up realizing that because she doesn't have anyone else in her life, because, you know, the guy that she had gotten pregnant by is not going to be a part of her life or anything, that it's really not as exciting or happy-go-lucky as she thought. One part of the movie that I quickly wanted to mention that always gets me, like, I've seen this movie 2 or 3 times, and one part of it that always gets me is the conversation between our journalist and the main teen that's pregnant. Pretty much they sit down to have more of an intimate talk, because I think that, like, our main teen can't really talk to her mom about sort of the emotions that she's feeling or the thoughts that she's having, because of just, like, how adamant her mom has been about, like, what an awful thing this is. But essentially she talks about how she's always wanted to be a mom, and that's really all that she wants, is to be a mom, have a family, and just live in that town and raise her kids. And of course the journalist is asking her, like, why don't you want more for yourself? And our main teen pretty much says, why should I want more for myself? Like, why can't I be perfectly happy with those things? You know, it's upsetting to hear that they don't think, or that people might not think, that she wants any more for her life, that it's not enough. And I think this is just a really interesting conversation, like, as somebody who's, like, looking back at how I was as a teenager and thinking about sort of the bubble that you live in when you're a teenager. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with desiring to be a mother or wanting to raise children. Like, that's something that my mom talked about, that when she was younger, that she really wanted to be a mother. However, I think the important thing to note is that when you're a teenager, you don't really know how much is out there. As well as, with her living in this sort of dream bubble, she doesn't take into account how her pregnancy would affect the people around her. Like I said earlier, her boyfriend mentioned that he didn't want children, and he mentions throughout that he has these goals of, like, playing sports and going to college and doing all of these things, and you can't really do that if you are trying to parent 24/7. And I think the main problem specifically with her being a teenage girl who wants to be a mom is that it relies very heavily on other people to take care of the other aspects of adulthood that you sometimes have to balance between being a parent and being an adult. Like, if you are an adult woman and you have worked a job before and you meet somebody and you decide to have kids together, that is a very different situation of, I just want to stay home and be a mom and take care of the household, than someone who has never worked a job and may or may not actually have, like, the help of a significant other. And in many ways, this idea of her just wanting to be a mom and, like, nothing else, I feel like, and this is just my opinion, it sort of takes that agency away from her getting to have these goals and other things going on in her life. And again, I'll reiterate that I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to be a mom, but I don't think it should be your only personal goal. Even though you are a mom for life once you have children, you're not always going to be their primary caregiver, so I wouldn't rely so heavily on that to fulfill your desire to be needed and wanted, because eventually when you are no longer needed by your children, there's gonna be some reflecting you'll have to do. I know I said I was going to briefly mention that, but I just thought that was a really interesting, like, plot point and, like, conversation, and sort of exactly what I was talking about in movies wanting you to ask questions to yourself about these things. Still, I find when I get to the end of this movie that I'm still very dissatisfied with how it ends. Even though everything seems to, like, turn out okay and everyone has seemed to come to, like, very neutral conclusions, they still end on a really weird note. They essentially end by putting all of the responsibility to not get pregnant on teen girls. And when you think about it that way, it really doesn't address the issue of responsibility on everyone's part, which is why I said I didn't like them asking the question of who to blame at the beginning, because there really is no clear answer. But of course they tried to answer it at the end, and they answered it wrong, in my opinion.
But then I suspect that most girls who get pregnant and decide to keep their babies will soon learn that nothing is going to turn out exactly like they expected. And that they've launched themselves onto a journey that is more difficult than they possibly could have imagined. What we need to do now is have a real conversation about how to help young women make more informed choices for themselves.
And I feel like movies like this especially are frustrating to think about, because a lot of the times they sort of exaggerate things that are almost an anomaly. Like, I'm not saying that this couldn't have happened more than once, whether it be a pregnancy pact or just like teen girls getting pregnant, but a lot of the times when you look into like statistics about teen pregnancies or just young girls being pregnant, a lot of the times they are alone in raising their children. And putting the responsibility on them is sort of unfair when you think about how, yes, teen boys do sometimes get girls pregnant, but a lot of the time, it's adult men. And that's why a lot of teen girls are, like, raising their children by themselves, because an adult man does not feel any sort of responsibility over someone that they can abandon because they're an adult and they can just do whatever they want. I say that in the sense that when you're an adult, you can, like, switch jobs, move places, blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you are a teenager, you're under your parents' roof more than likely, so you don't have as much freedom or ability to, like, move about. And they even sort of briefly, like, almost touch on it when one of the girls gets pregnant by somebody that she doesn't know, who's, like, very clearly an older person. I don't know if they're, like, an adult man and it's, like, a statutory situation, or if it just is like an older high school boy, like someone who is a senior and she's like a sophomore kind of thing. Either way, I think movies like this, while it is based on a true story about these girls getting like pregnant for a pact, or like getting pregnant because they thought it would be like cool to do it together and raise their kids together, it doesn't really serve to like dampen any of the anxiety that someone would feel about this sort of situation happening. Like, if I was a parent, this would not work to dampen any anxiety I feel about my teenage girl getting pregnant. And while it may seem that I'm taking this movie like too seriously and it's not that deep, for one, I don't think anything can really be said it's not that deep, because there are so many things that, like, if you live in America, pretty much everything in some way is almost always related to, like, slavery. Like, seriously, if you do your research on a lot of different things, you will find that a lot of them are rooted in some sort of slavery. So yeah, a lot of the times it really is that deep, and it does deserve attention. You may also be saying, well, this is just one case, and they make a lot of other crazy movies that, like, obviously would never give you anxiety about something like that happening, because, like, how would this happen? And I will say that a lot of their other movies, and the movie I'm going to talk about next week, almost always have some weird twist that just makes it completely unbelievable that, like, your neighbor or, like, your son's girlfriend or something like that is, like, this, like, actually insidious person that's out to get you. Because most of the time, that's just not true. But I will say that this is not the only case where I think hysteria is sort of prompted by this specific group of people in this, like, stereotypical demographic. I feel like oftentimes the people falling for these types of rumors and go to extremes are people who are willing to believe in fearing first before they get the proper information. And while in America that could literally cover like a slew of demographics, the one that I'm talking about in terms of like suburban moms and housewives and that group of people, I think that they are often the ones who continue to perpetuate them just out of pure misinformation. I often think of cases to do with like Halloween candy being laced or satanic panic that sort of come and go on and off every year. Even things like trafficking misinformation are often spread throughout this demographic. I know this because I've talked to enough people from this demographic that will bring up these subjects as if they are true and factual. However, if you do even a little bit of research into any of these cases, you'll find that a lot of the fear is really just one case of something that was blown out of proportion or was just completely misreported. Like, the fear surrounding Halloween candy laced with some sort of drug or, like, razors or something like that is really confusing to me. One, because why would I give away free drugs? That seems weird. Two, there was really only one confirmed case of a child being poisoned way back when this first appeared, and the poisoning didn't even happen from a stranger. It was literally that kid's dad. Or when we think about something like the Satanic Panic in its relationship to, like, Dungeons and Dragons. If you've ever played Dungeons and Dragons, you know that there's not some weird cult following that promotes, like, Satanism. More so, it's just a bunch of nerds playing a game. And even more so, it bothers me when real issues, like the issue of human trafficking throughout the world, that is a very prevalent problem, and it is a real thing, that get watered down by rumors about, like, zip ties and stuff, when in reality, a lot of the times, when crimes like this are committed, it is by someone that you know or someone that you are close to. A lot of the times when people are getting trafficked, it's because they have some relationship to the person, they have some sort of friendship or romantic relationship that they got caught up in a sketchy situation with them. Again, it's not to say that any of these things couldn't happen individually, but more than likely they are not across the board. And that's why the idea of these particular types of movies bothers me, because it almost works into perpetuating the anxiety surrounding things that you don't know. This also makes me think of the movie Grim Cuddy. While it's not like an amazing movie and kind of has a ridiculous name, and oh my gosh, the monster makes me laugh so hard, it does bring up a good point. A lot of the themes throughout that movie ring true. The movie Grim Cuddy is about a bunch of teenagers who are cutting and hurting themselves from an internet trend that turns out to be sort of this, like, haunting that is only made true by believing in it. There's, like, a monster type figure that appears to them, but only to them, so it's like a haunting, but also there's a monster. Either way, it shines a light on how many parents don't seem to be as wary of, or maybe just don't have the media literacy to inform themselves completely before jumping to conclusions. The parents in the film immediately try to lock away all forms of social media instead of talking to their children about the trend to hear their thoughts and opinions on it, thus making the monster stronger. And I will say that the parents in the movie do try, but they just don't quite get there. Needless to say, the problem with causing hysteria through media is that it can take on a life of its own. And I'm not sitting here saying that Lifetime specifically causes any particular hysteria, but it does seem to capitalize on a lot of the one-off situations that would be scary if they happened often, but are really ridiculous when you think about how it probably didn't even happen that way. And it is frustrating to see that Lifetime essentially is capitalizing on this sort of anxiety that adults may feel about their particular lives by portraying at the beginning of the movie a life that that person might very well be living at that moment. And I know that most people can watch these movies with the understanding that it's not real or that it's improbable or outlandish for any of these situations to occur in their own life. But for those who specifically identify with the characters in the movies, it can be very frightening to see your worst fears being put on screen. And I know that Lifetime isn't the only one who makes movies like this, who sort of capitalize on these either one-off events or sort of the hysteria that people feel or the anxiety that people feel around certain issues. But I think it's very interesting that that is like part of their brand. More so, I think it's just important to keep in mind that these movies are purely entertainment, even if they are based on true events sometimes. And I do recognize that Lifetime does actually make movies that are, like, not just based on true events, like, loosely based on true events, but, like, very much are, like, true crime cases that happened, and they follow it a little more closely to the reality of the situation, because sometimes it really is just that crazy. But if I do talk about, like, true crime movies and, like, their accuracy and things like that, I will more than likely put it in its own episode that is not specifically about Lifetime true crime movies, but just about true crime movies in general and like the fictionalization of true crime for like TV entertainment. But that may be an episode for like next year or like somewhere in the future, because I do find that to be a really interesting topic, especially being a true crime listener. But for now, I really just wanted to talk about this like weird genre of like Lifetime movies that specifically capitalizes on the anxiety that can be sort of like poked or provoked in the demographic that they are aiming their content towards, which is this stereotypical suburban housewife who has nothing better to do than like meddle in their kids' lives or worry about the neighbors moving in next door because, you know, they were out in the yard digging in the middle of the night, sort of thing. If you know, you know. And I'd love to know what you guys think about this particular topic down below. But with that, keep watching movies, and I'll see you in the next episode.